A leaked UN report blames regional powers for much of the violence in Libya. The UAE and Egypt are singled out for supplying weapons to rival armed groups in violation of UN sanctions. So, what can be done to stop this? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Libya has been in a heightened state of violence for much of the past 6 years. The overthrow of leader Muammar Gaddafi has created a dangerous, politically divided atmosphere. The country has 2 rival seats of power, along with several dozen armed groups fighting for control. Now, a leaked UN report has shed some light on who's backing some of those forces. It says the United Arab Emirates and Egypt have been supplying weapons to armed groups on the ground. That's despite a UN arms embargo. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Mohammed al-Bardisi.
Armed groups in Libya are continuing to receive foreign support from nations aiming to influence who will control the oil-rich nation. That's according to a panel of United Nations experts. After the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, during the Arab Spring, Libya spiraled into civil war between rival political factions. International sanctions were imposed in reaction to gross and systematic violations of human rights. The latest report highlights countries that have both directly and indirectly fueled the ongoing conflict in Libya. It mentions the repeated air raids by the Egyptian Air Force on the El Hilal oil areas to support the forces of renegade General Khalifa Haftar.
You have countries in the Gulf as well as Egypt who see their foreign policy not only as directed towards intergovernmental relations, but as putting governments in place in various countries or imposing policies that are in line with their definition of national security and their geopolitical designs. And on the other hand, you have countries that see a business opportunity here and are willing to exploit that.
The UN panel reported last June that the United Arab Emirates violated international law by supplying Haftar forces with attack helicopters and other military aircraft. Pro-Haftar groups have been accused of kidnapping and torturing journalists, activists, and religious figures in eastern Libya, some of whom faced extrajudicial executions. This latest report is set to be submitted to the UN Security Council for further action, in hopes that it can counter foreign influence in the war-torn nation. Mohammed al-Bardisi, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guests. In London, Sami Hamdi, editor-in-chief of International Interest. Joining us on Skype from Stockholm, Pieter Wezeman, senior researcher in the Arms and Military Expenditure program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And also on Skype from London, Anas El-Gomati, director of the Sadiq Institute, a think tank based in Tripoli. Thank you all for joining us. Now, Anas, I want to start with you. Is it at all surprising to hear that the UN is once again highlighting violations of the arms embargo in Libya, and that the UAE and Egypt are named as offenders in this report as well?
Well, it's not surprising. I think it's a terrible shame that this has been going on, not only recently, but has been going on for at least 4 years, since the beginning of the civil war that began in July of 2014. But I think it's more troubling to hear this report now, given that the international community has given Libya probably until around September 2018 to move towards elections. And what this tells me is that the key regional actors, that is Egypt and the Emirates, and key local actors, specifically their surrogates and proxies, such as Khalifa Haftar and the Libyan National Army, are not ripening towards peaceful elections, but they're ripening towards something much more lethal. They're ripening towards more war and more conflict. And that certainly doesn't inspire a lot of belief in the peaceful process or the political process, but it also comes in and questions the role of the UN. And it begs a very simple question. Is it the right time to call for elections if you're going to allow for the arms embargoes to be continually violated, and for countries that have seemingly on the surface in their rhetoric support the elections, but are also backing those that they want to win the elections peacefully and violently?
Pieter, this is the second time that the UAE has been called out by the UN. Where is the pressure on them to stop this?
That's a very good question. I think it's not even the second time. I think it has happened already before. that major questions have been raised about how the UAE is arming specific actors in Libya. And it doesn't seem that any specific action has been taken either by the UN community, either trying to tell Libya or tell the UAE in clear terms that they can't go ahead with this, put some pressure on them, maybe threatening with some sort of sanctions towards them. That has not happened. And also, the UAE gets those weapons from somewhere. And one can also wonder to which extent the countries that are involved in supplying the weapons, which the UAE can then supply to the actors in Libya, what they have done to actually prevent this from happening. And that remains a very big question mark. There's nothing which indicates what I've seen that much pressure has been put on the UAE to actually stop these supplies against the UN Security Council resolutions related to Libya.
Sami, from your vantage point, what could be done by the UN, by the international community, by the EU, by other actors to stop the flow of arms into Libya?
I think first and foremost, we should be wary about how we skew the narrative in Libya with our focus on the UAE and Egypt. Because we have to also remember that before Khalifa Haftar, when Islamist-leaning militias and the like, when they were armed, they also participated in some of atrocities, including the blockade on Beni Walid. So I think the first things first is that we have to acknowledge that this is a wider problem, more than the UAE and Egypt. It also includes the likes of Turkey, includes the US, includes France, includes Italy. Secondly, we're looking at this UN report, but we must also acknowledge that France has received Khalifa Haftar, the US has engaged in negotiations with him and the like. So I think we're looking at a wider civil war in which we shouldn't necessarily look at this as a right or wrong party when we're looking at the flow of weapons. Weapons are arriving on all different sides. Moreover, these various different groups are applying their own pressure. The Islamist militias in Tripoli do not recognize the UN-backed government, and neither does Khalifa Haftar. Libya has become a free-for-all. And I think with regards to Egypt and regards to the UAE, Egypt shares a border with Libya. What Egypt fears is that Libya will fall under Islamist governance, which would be a threat to Sisi's government. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a fan of Sisi, but we're just describing why he's particularly interested in Egypt. It's the same with the UAE. It has a very anti-Muslim Brotherhood agenda. So I think although it's right that we focus on the UAE, it's right that we focus on the flow of arms, we should be wary that the flow of arms is not just going to Haftar. It's going to Islamist militias, it's going to the Zintan militia, it's going to Misrata, it's going to Benghazi, all of these various different forces, because Libya, let's be honest, is a cake in which everybody is trying to get a slice of it, whether it's Italy, whether it's France, whether it's US, or whether it's Egypt and the UAE.
Anas, I want to get your reaction to what Sami was just saying, but also if we're talking about international players who have an interest in Libya, let's not forget Russia. Where does Russia stand right now, and are they in fact backing General Haftar?
Well, I think you largely have two coalitions, or two factions rather, when it comes to the supply of weapons. I think Sami's point is entirely true, that every country that has had a vested interest in Libya since 2011 has probably broken one of those arms violations, whether they were giving it to quote-unquote Islamists or other rebel factions, or whether they were giving it to the Libyan National Army and a coalition of militias that fight for Khalifa Haftar. But I think there is a slight nuance, because I think maybe the binary shouldn't necessarily be Islamists and the others, but today the binary really is civil government or military government. That the supply of weapons that has gone towards, or the violations of the arms embargo that has gone towards Islamist militias, be them in Tripoli or Misrata or elsewhere in the country, that is definitely a violation that we should condemn, and I condemn it in the clearest of terms. But it's not there to induce or to install a military government. Those same militias don't necessarily have grand plans, and they haven't been able to make any traction since 2014. But I see today's arms embargoes violations being a sign of a wider malaise. And I think the wider malaise really is, this is there to be an induction or the installation of a regime that is a military regime that would return Libya to a form of governance that not only was there for the last 42 years before the revolution, but is also something that goes really to the heart of Egyptian and Emirati foreign policy, which is, this is not about Islamists. This isn't about the grand Islamic question of whether or not Islam is the way that we can conduct daily and political life in Libya. It's about having an alternative that threatens military regimes, and that should be the clearest of terms. A civil government, a government where you can hold suits and ties to account, is a fragile government. It's a government that has to be held to account by its own people, and that is not a government or a regime or a nature of political daily life that is going to be tolerated by the Emirates and the Egyptians. And I think that's really where I tie it in together. But to go back to what Sami is saying, I certainly agree that any and all arms embargo violations, should be condemned. But I think this one has, there is a wider reason why regional actors and local actors invest in this kind of move, and they do so because it doesn't empower liberals, it doesn't empower civil government, it empowers demagogues, and we should be very clear about that. To the point about Russia, Russia's foreign policy has always been, it's a feeling here again, it's very, very difficult, but they're more tactical than strategic. They don't necessarily have a very firm understanding of Libya, but they know what they want to see, which is not a return, so it's not the continuation of a civil-led government, it's perhaps a military regime, but I think it's also a question of trying to poke the Americans in the eye wherever they can. They want to try to remove some of the hegemony from the very countries that brought in the Arab Spring, and they always want to reference that the Arab Spring was a failed attempt at bringing democracy to the Middle East and North Africa, and that it shouldn't be done this way. So I view Russia's foreign policy ambitions in cynical terms, but I wouldn't move away from the fact that they have ambitions. In the last week, they've spoken about and given clear indications that if there was an opportunity to build a military base in Libya, they would certainly pursue that.
Pieter, the government of national accord in Libya was supposed to bring conflicting political and military sides together. Why hasn't that happened? Is it simply because of the questions of who has control over certain factions of armed forces?
I think that's a very good question. It's not something which I'm very well disposed to answer myself. I just know that there is a major, let's say, difference between the groups, and that each of them has found their different backers, and that the UAE has chosen one of those to back and to supply arms to them. How they can come to an agreement, that is a major issue, and that also refers very much to the fact that the panel of experts that is investigating the arms embargo violations is very careful in its statements there, because it itself doesn't really know who the legitimate government of Libya really is, and therefore who, according to the UN Security Council resolutions, potentially might be eligible to get arms after, of course, the UN Security Council, through the UN Sanctions Commission has given permission for that. So in that chaos, it is extremely difficult to determine who is allowed to have military force, who is allowed to use it, and who is allowed to actually, at a certain point in time, get arms.
Sami, could you envision any scenario by which General Haftar could participate in any political agreements or political process going forward?
I think, look, this is going to be difficult for me to say, because it's one of those like catch-22 issues. If you put yourself in Khalifa Haftar's position, whereby you sided with the internationally recognized government and the Islamist militias in Tripoli rejected that international recognized government, the secular parties refused to acknowledge the elections because they didn't win in it. They started telling the world that Libya wasn't ready for democracy. How do you take the other party seriously? The problem with Libya is that every party only accepts democracy insofar as they're the parties that win. I also object to the binary of civil government versus military government. The UAE, it's more than just hegemony over Libya. The UAE quite simply do not trust the Muslim Brotherhood. Take, for example, Saudi's reaction to President Morsi's visit to Tehran. Saudis felt backstabbed, they felt betrayed. They said, why is the Muslim Brotherhood doing this? We gave you a chance, we backed off on the Arab Spring when you won, even though we don't like you, and you've gone and stabbed us in the back by going to Tehran and signing tourism agreements. There is no trust with the Muslim Brotherhoods or the Islamist regimes. And when we're talking about Libya's civil war problem, let's be brutally honest here. The very parties that want Haftar to disarm are the very parties that invited NATO to Libya in the first place. They couldn't get rid of Gaddafi on their own, so they brought NATO to completely destroy Libya and upend the political balance. I'm not saying that Gaddafi was a good man, but the problem with the NATO interference was that it came in, it bombed the daylights out of Libya, and it tried to prop up certain parties that other parties weren't happy with. You had no political accord. There was no leader of this revolution. There was no leadership to guide Libya into a future. All you had was chaos. So now you have a civil war. Suppose Haftar disarms tomorrow. Let's envisage it. Suppose Haftar tomorrow says, you know what, guys, I'm sorry, I'm going to disarm. How do you deal with the conflicting factions in Tripoli? How do you deal with Zintan? How do you deal with Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi, who wants to come forward to the elections? The problem is not only Haftar, even though he is a disastrous problem. The problem is with all of the Libyan factions who quite simply cannot look at each other and sit at the table and say, you know what, I recognize you as Libyan. The Muslim Brotherhood want Libya, Haftar wants Libya, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi wants Libya, and the biggest issue is this: the US doesn't know who to support. The US is baffled, France is baffled, Italy is baffled, UK is baffled. For France and the UK, this was supposed to be a straightforward operation. We go in, we remove Gaddafi, we get the contracts, and we rebuild Libya. For the US, it was supposed to be straightforward. We get rid of Gaddafi, we establish hegemony in Libya, and we prevent the spread of terrorism. But now it's all over the place, because now you have Qatar and Turkey on one hand, and then you have UAE and Egypt on the other hand, and both lobbying Washington, lobbying Paris, lobbying London for international support. This is the reason why I say we should be wary how we skew the narrative. Even if you got rid of UAE and Egypt, and I believe they are a disastrous influence on Libya, I will say it. I believe they are a disastrous influence on Libya. If you remove them, it does not remove the core issue here, which is how do you reconcile NATO interference in Libya? How do you reconcile the fact that nobody really wants elections? And how do you reconcile trying to bring a power that can actually bring peace to Libya? Moreover, and on this last point before I hand over so I don't speak for too long, how do you reconcile these tribes who bore the brunt of the revenge of many of these militias who rose up against Gaddafi? Bani Walid will never forget the blockade that was done to them. Watfallah will never forget the damage that was done to them in the revenge attacks. All of these innocent people who simply followed the wave, which is the Gaddafi wave, were punished and brutally punished. Libya needs a very serious national reconciliation, and they could take great lessons from South Africa and Mandela's Amnesty Commission, instead of going in and taking revenge and passing a law banning every Gaddafi-era politician and torturing and abusing former prime ministers like Baghdadi al-Mahmoudi.
Anas, you heard Sami talk about concrete steps that need to be taken to reconcile the situation in Libya. I want to talk for a minute about Ghassan Salama, who's the UN envoy to Libya. Now, what has he done? Has he been able to achieve anything since taking that job?
I think this is really down to the point that Sami is making when you connect it to what Ghassan Salama's job is. And I think that the questions are honest, and the audit of what Sami has said is largely honest. And I think people that were the most vulnerable in society bore the brunt of the pain that was endured throughout the NATO campaign, certainly in 2011. But NATO's campaign was really, at least in my view, and it's a view, it's an opinion, it's not a fact, was a place that they left after 2011 and left and allowed regional parties, whether it be Turkey and Qatar, whether it be Egypt and the Emirates, to try to fight over the nature of a regime. So I think it's Libya's sovereignty that has been brutally fought over the last couple of years. And that continues to be a problem, because what is central to this and what is central to Ghassan Salama's job is that ultimately he needs to try to reconcile those groups into something. And Truth and Reconciliation, a national peace accord, has never been done. That's why we call it a government of national accord, not a peace government, not a government of national unity, because at the moment it's still the same case. An arms embargo is not just the fact that some weapons came through boats and allowed themselves to move onto Libyan soil. It's the very fact that they ripen you towards war. They make war lucrative and they make peace very, very costly. And I think in that respect, many of today's Libya's factions, whether it be Khalifa Haftar, whether it be other groups that were in Tripoli, and I certainly have my difference of opinion on the way that this history emerged over the last couple of years, but it's not really the central point today, because we have to look forward. And I think looking forward, we need to try to find a way in which we can assert Libya's sovereignty. And I think that's really Ghassan Salama's job. It's not my ability to do so as a Libyan. And unfortunately, if those Libyan actors are committed towards procuring weapons, then we have to stop the mechanisms to which they use and which they employ. And the second is that we have to make sure that those weapons are not coming into the country at a moment where we're moving to, it's again, a very, very fragile moment where any group, whether it be Islamists or others, and again, I still don't buy that narrative. I think it's groups that feel that they're going to be they're going to bear the brunt of being wiped out, versus groups that want to be empowered and monopolize power. And that's typically where people make, or groups make, investments in weapons, is because they want to monopolize, and they haven't made an investment in trying to monopolize power. So I think Ghassan Salama's real job today is making sure that Libya is a safe place to conduct free and fair elections, and the conditions have to be free, and the actual way that we conduct our the timeline towards moving to elections has to be fair. There has to be the sense of freedom in the air before people can make a real choice about what kind of state they want to have. And let's not forget that Libya is also moving towards a moment where they're going to have a referendum on the constitution.
Anas, let me just interrupt you for a second, because I'm going to come back to you with regards to the elections in just a moment. But first, I want to ask Pieter about another point. Have international sanctions imposed on Libya in any way, have they had an impact when it comes to the flow of weapons into Libya?
Good question. I think they have, but they haven't stopped them completely. they've made very clear, and that's clear, very clear agreement amongst most countries, except, of course, those countries which have decided to anyway supply arms, that it is not the moment to now supply arms to Libya. Russia has been mentioned before as a country that wants to have influence, and there have been discussions about Russia potentially supplying arms to, for example, the Libyan National Army under Haftar. But there's no proof, no evidence that they actually did. And I think they have lived up to the requirements of the arms embargo, especially also because they are in the UN Security Council and they don't necessarily want to be seen to act against their own decisions. So overall, I think the total flow of arms to Libya and maybe also arms flowing out of Libya has probably been restricted due to this international action, the UN embargo on the country, which only allows arms supplies under very specific conditions. However, then there are a few countries, and the UAE seems to be the most important one as far as the evidence shows, the evidence that the UN panel has collected. They have decided to not listen to this embargo. And here again, the problem is that apparently no one has really put enough pressure on them to make them do this according to the agreed rule. And the agreed rule is actually, and we should remember this, not a full arms embargo, but a system in which you can supply weapons to Libya if you get the permission from the United Nations Sanctioned Committee or the United Nations Security Council in effect. So you can do that, but only in a very controlled way, really trying to build up security forces in Libya itself, which then supposedly should do some good. And that, of course, has not happened until now.
Okay, Anas, I want to get back to the point about the elections, because despite how bad the situation is in Libya right now, we've heard the EU, we've heard the UN, we've heard the international community continue to say that they would like to see elections, both parliamentary and presidential, being held in Libya in 2018. Is that in any way realistic?
Well, it's realistic because it's an administrative process. You dip your finger in ink and hey presto, there's been an election. But it's the question of what happens the day after. And I think, as Sami has mentioned earlier on, though I definitely disagree with the way in which he's framed that, because I think there's always this question with Libya that there's got to be someone there to spoil. And I think he's confused perhaps grievance for greed. And I think there are certainly groups on the ground that have legitimate grievances. He mentioned one of them, Beni Walid, and other groups that fell out of favor in the former regime, but were exploited by actors during elections. They were exploited by actors like Khalifa Haftar, who initiated his operation on May 15, 2014, before the election results, before the move towards an internationally recognized government in Tobruk. So I think there are things there that have to be understood, and we shouldn't amputate history. And we should also realize that elections are a time where we decide legitimacy but not legality. And I think that's something that Sami also confused. Just because you're legitimate doesn't make everything that you do legal. Doesn't mean that you can break Geneva Conventions about human rights and the way that you treat prisoners of war. And I think this is the problem that I have now, is that legitimacy isn't a word, it's a currency. And elections decide that currency. It gives someone a mandate, a lease of life for 5 years, to effectively do what Sami was saying, which is when they're internationally recognized, they can pretty much do whatever they want. That's the danger in a country like Libya when you have so much weapons.
Anas, I just need to interrupt you because I want to give Sami the chance to reply. Sami, very quickly, I'm going to give you the last point here. You heard Anas disagree with some of the points you made. Would you like to reply to him?
I think Anas just confirmed everything I said when I say that democracy is only satisfactory if you win. He talks about legality, but not legitimacy. In fact, I can vote for somebody, but he still has to do exactly what I want. This is the attitude that has hampered Libya. This is the attitude that has hampered any process for elections. But here's the real reason why elections may not go ahead, or why there is genuine fear for elections. There's genuine fear because the irony is, and to be honest, this quite hurts me to say it, that Saif al-Islam Gaddafi is the prime candidate. That the Libyans, if given the choice, they are sick and tired of a lot of this instability, that they want to go back to the devil they know than the devil that they don't know. So this is the biggest issue here. If the parties believe that Saif al-Islam doesn't stand a good chance, they will allow the elections. If they believe that he can come back to power, then they will not allow the elections. He holds the power card. And I think genuinely, Anas has summed it up perfectly. The reason why Libyans are terrified of elections, because it's all me or nothing. I take all or nothing. And that's the reason why Libya, currently, based on the current circumstances, the solution can only be a military victory. And that upsets me deeply.
Gentlemen, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all our guests, Sami Hamdi, Pieter Wezeman, and Anas El Gomati. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.